Jordan had always known what it felt like to be different. The whispers behind his back, the sideways glances, the silent judgments in a classroom full of faces that would never truly see him. To be the only black boy in a sea of privilege, always trying to prove he belonged, yet always feeling like an outsider. But when the one person he trusted betrayed him, he realized that the fight for his place in the world was only beginning. And this time, the stakes were higher than he ever imagined. Would he be able to expose the truth without losing himself in the process? The classroom was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world outside had been muffled and all that remained was a fragile bubble, teetering on the edge of something inevitable. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped patterns on the desks and the students' faces. It should have been a warm, inviting moment, but there was an unspoken tension hanging in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Jordan sat at the back of the room, his body tense, his mind elsewhere. His pen hovered above the notebook in front of him, not because he didn't want to write, but because he wasn't sure if he could. The words the teacher spoke were meaningless to him now. Those words about unity and peace, about a dream that felt like a lifetime ago, a dream that had never truly belonged to him. Ms. Williams, the teacher, stood at the front of the room, her voice rising and falling with the conviction of someone who truly believed in the ideals she taught. She was passionate, a true believer, her hands gesturing in the air as she spoke about Dr. King's dream, about love and understanding conquering hate. But as she spoke, Jordan's gaze drifted toward the two figures at the front of class, Jason and Tyler. Jason, tall and lanky with the trademark blonde hair of a jock, and Tyler, his shorter, stockier friend, both sitting with their eyes locked on the front of the room, their lips curling into the kind of smile that wasn't friendly, not by any measure. The two of them whispered in low tones, but their words carried to Jordan's ears with unnerving clarity. He could feel their eyes on him, the judgment in their gaze sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. Jason glanced back at Jordan, a sneer creeping across his face. He didn't even try to hide it. "Look at him," Jason whispered to Tyler, just loud enough for Jordan to hear. "Thinking he's some kind of hero. Like he's too good for us. What's he even doing here?" Tyler's response was a quiet chuckle, his eyes never leaving Jordan, probably waiting for someone to thank him for being so special. Jordan's stomach tightened. His hands clenched around the pen in his grasp, his knuckles turning white, the pen tip digging into the paper. He tried to focus on the lesson, to drown out the whispers, but it was impossible. Their words had found their mark. This wasn't new. He'd been the target before, countless times, but today felt different. The mocking was more vicious, the words more cutting. A crumpled paper ball suddenly hit his desk, landing with a soft thud. It wasn't the first time, and Jordan fought the urge to react, to throw the ball back or say something, anything that would make them stop. But he didn't. He never did. Instead, he sat still, staring at the paper ball, feeling the heat rise in his face, the flush of humiliation spreading through his chest. The laughter spread, soft at first, but growing louder, more sure of itself. Jordan remained silent, his gaze fixed on the desk in front of him, willing himself not to react, not to let them see how badly it hurt. But it did hurt. Every laugh, every whisper, every mocking glance, they all piled up inside him, each one digging deeper into his pride, his patience. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to say something that would make them feel as small as they made him feel, but all he could do was sit there, paralyzed by the weight of their cruelty. Ms. Williams spoke, her voice cutting through the noise, her back turned to the class as she wrote something on the board. "We're all equal in the eyes of God," she said, though her words seem hollow now, as if they had no place here. Not in this room, not today. Unity comes from understanding, from love. Jason's voice broke through again, more mocking this time, more deliberate. "Yeah, love," he scoffed. "Tell that to him." The room seemed to freeze. All eyes were on Jordan now, waiting for him to do something, anything. The weight of their stares pressed down on him, and in that moment, everything inside him snapped. Without a word, He pushed his chair back, the scraping sound against the floor cutting through the laughter like a knife. Every eye in the room turned to him. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow, the noise of the class fading into the background. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his breath was shallow, but he didn't care. He couldn't sit there any longer. Not with them watching, not with the laughter still echoing in his ears. He stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he grabbed his things, his eyes locking with Jason's for the briefest of moments. But Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He simply turned, his body stiff, and walked toward the door. The door creaked as it opened, the sound startling in the otherwise quiet classroom. Jordan stepped out into the hallway, the cool air of the corridor a welcome relief. He leaned against the wall for a moment, his breath ragged. His pulse still thundered in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through him. He was angry. He was hurt. But most of all, he was tired. Tired of the looks. Tired of the whispers. Tired of the silence. The door behind him creaked open, and he didn't need to turn around to know that Ms. Williams had followed him out. She stood there in the doorway for a moment, her face a mixture of concern and confusion, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made Jordan feel like maybe, just maybe, she understood. "I'll be fine," Jordan said, his voice cold, his words clipped. He didn't want her pity, didn't want her to ask him to come back inside, to try and fix something that couldn't be fixed. Ms. Williams didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable, and then turned back to the classroom, leaving him standing there, alone in the empty hallway. Jordan's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling. He knew this wouldn't be the last time it happened. He knew this wasn't over, but he didn't know what would happen next, what he would do, what they would do. All he knew was that he couldn't go back in there. Not now. Not like this. And that was just the beginning. Jordan sat on the edge of the old, creaky bench in the school's hallway, his legs crossed tightly in front of him, his thoughts far away from the high school's walls. His hands still gripped the worn leather of his jacket, a small act of self-comfort, though it did little to calm the storm swirling inside him. The door behind him creaked open, and the soft footfalls of Ms. Williams broke the silence. She didn't say anything immediately. She didn't need to. She had seen the fight in his eyes, the same fight she had seen in so many students before him. But Jordan wasn't like the others. She could feel it in the tense set of his shoulders, the way he looked at the world like it was something he had to conquer, something that didn't always give back what he put into it. "Jordan," Ms. Williams finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to run away." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. His lips parted, as if to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He shook his head, his eyes flicking toward the closed door behind her. "It's not worth it," he muttered, almost to himself. "It never changes." Ms. Williams took a step closer, her shoes tapping softly on the linoleum floor. "You're wrong," she said. "It doesn't always feel like it, but change starts with people like you, the ones who don't give up." Jordan's jaw tightened. "I don't know if I'm the one to change anything." His voice barely rose above a whisper. Jordan had always been the quiet type. His presence often went unnoticed, and that's how he preferred it. He was used to being invisible, to fading into the background, watching life from the edges. He had learned over the years that being quiet was the safest way to survive. He didn't rock the boat, didn't make waves. But even though Jordan tried to hide, there was always something about him that stood out. His sharp eyes, the intensity behind them, the way he carried himself. There was no mistaking it. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. Jordan was the kind of person who seemed to be carrying the weight of the world, even if he didn't want to. And it wasn't just his inner turmoil that set him apart. It was the color of his skin. Jordan had been told time and time again that his race would define him. In this world, it wasn't just about who you were, it was about what you looked like. And Jordan knew that, more than most. His family, his community, they had all tried to protect him from the harshness of the world. But no matter how much they tried to shield him, the ugliness always found a way to seep through. Jason, on the other hand, never seemed to care about the consequences. His world was one of privilege, a world where the rules didn't apply to him. He had it easy. He was popular, charismatic, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and command attention without even trying. His blonde hair, always a little too messy, his athletic build, the cocky grin on his face, it all added up to someone who had never been told no. Life was simple for Jason. It was about winning, being the best, and laughing at the ones who couldn't keep up. But there was something deeper in Jason too, a need to feel superior, to always be in control. He was the type to put others down in order to lift himself up, to make sure that no one ever questioned his authority. His relationship with Jordan was built on this power dynamic. He picked on Jordan not just because it was easy, but because it made him feel powerful. In his world, people like Jordan didn't belong. Who does he think he is? Jason muttered to Tyler one day, watching Jordan as he walked across the hall, lost in his thoughts, thinking he's got something to prove. Like anyone cares. Tyler, always the sidekick, smirked. He was the kind of person who lived in the shadows of others, feeding off their energy, following their lead. He was less outspoken than Jason, but no less cruel. His loyalty to Jason was unwavering, and he reveled in the sense of belonging that came with being part of the popular crowd. Tyler didn't have an identity of his own. He was whatever Jason needed him to be. Silent, compliant, the perfect second in command. Tyler's gaze lingered on Jordan, a twisted grin forming on his lips. He doesn't even fight back, man. That's what makes him so pathetic. Like he doesn't know what it means to stand up for himself. Jason laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. You're right. He's not worth the effort. But even as he said it, his eyes followed Jordan with a trace of something deeper, something darker. It wasn't just about hurting him anymore. It was about breaking him. Then there was Ms. Williams. She had always seen potential in Jordan, something that he himself couldn't see. She was the kind of teacher who went beyond the textbook, who cared, who noticed when something was wrong. She wasn't like the others who saw only the surface. She knew that Jordan was more than just the quiet kid who kept to himself. He had a fire inside him, a fire that, when kindled, could change everything. But it wasn't just about teaching. It was about making a difference. And that's why Ms. Williams had stayed at this school, year after year, despite the struggles. She believed in the power of education, but more than that, she believed in the power of compassion. The world needed more of it, especially in a school like this, where division was rampant, and kids like Jordan were treated as if they didn't matter. Ms. Williams had seen her fair share of students slip through the cracks. Kids who were too different, too quiet, too loud, too anything that didn't fit the mold. She had watched them fall, one by one, as the world outside their classrooms crushed them under the weight of expectations they could never meet. She wasn't going to let that happen to Jordan. Don't let them break you. She had told him more than once. You're stronger than you think. But Jordan wasn't so sure. And then there was Jordan's family. They had tried so hard to shield him from the worst of the world. His mother, a strong and resilient woman who had raised him alone, worked long hours to make sure he had everything he needed. His father, absent for much of his life, had been a shadow in Jordan's past, someone who couldn't be counted on, someone who never stuck around long enough to leave an impression. But his mother, she had always been there. She had raised him with the knowledge that the world would be harder for him than it would be for others, especially given his skin color. She had warned him to be careful, to pick his battles, to be smart. She knew the stakes. She knew what it meant to fight a battle that you couldn't win, and that knowledge shaped everything she did, including how she raised her son. Jordan understood why she acted the way she did, but sometimes, when he looked at her, he wondered if it was enough. Could her warnings and her love really shield him from what was coming? Could he ever truly escape the hate that followed him? In the distance, Jason and Tyler could be seen whispering, the same cruel smiles on their faces, the same insidious thoughts running through their heads. They knew what they were doing. They knew exactly what kind of power they held over people like Jordan. But the day was coming when things would change. The world they had built around themselves would come crashing down, piece by piece. And when it did, Jordan would be the one to set the fire. In these moments, Jordan realized something. He could no longer remain invisible. He had to make a choice. Continue to be the quiet, invisible boy who let things slide, or stand up, not just for himself, but for everything he believed in. The path wouldn't be easy. It never was. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't run anymore. The storm was coming, and Jordan was ready to face it. Jordan's heart raced as he walked down the hallway, the sound of his sneakers against the linoleum floor echoing in the quiet corridor. The school had always been a place of tension for him, filled with stares, whispers, and the constant feeling of being an outsider. But today, something felt different. There was an undeniable heaviness in the air, an undercurrent of unease that he couldn't shake. He felt it in the pit of his stomach as he passed the classrooms, each door a barrier between him and the world he had come to know. He glanced over his shoulder, his senses heightened. There was a certain energy in the way people moved today, the way they whispered behind their hands and shot quick glances. He'd never been the type to ask questions, to dig too deep into things that weren't his business, but today he couldn't ignore it. When he reached his locker, he took a deep breath, hoping to steady his nerves before the next class. But as he turned the combination dial, the door swung open with a sharp, metallic clang. His eyes locked on the sheet of paper wedged between his books. He pulled out slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he read the words scrawled across the page. "You're nothing but a shadow. Stay invisible, or else." Jordan's pulse quickened. It wasn't the first time he had been targeted, but something about this note felt different, darker. The tone was chilling, and the words seemed to be a warning, a threat. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching him from the shadows. But the hallway was empty, and for a brief moment, it felt like he was the only one in the world. His hand gripped the note tightly, crumpling it into a ball as anger bubbled beneath the surface. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't be afraid. But as the paper crunched in his fist, he realized the reality of the situation. This wasn't just schoolyard teasing anymore. It was something more sinister. Someone had gone out of their way to make him feel small, to remind him of his place. And whoever had done this wasn't done yet. Before he could even process his thoughts, the sound of footsteps broke his focus. He turned to see Ms. Williams approaching, her expression concerned as she glanced from him to the crumpled paper in his hand. "Jordan," she asked softly, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos inside his mind. "Is everything okay?" He opened his mouth, about to brush her off, to tell her it was nothing, but then he saw the worry in her eyes. She wasn't like the others. She actually cared. And for some reason, that made it harder to lie to her. "No," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not." Ms. Williams nodded slowly, taking a step closer, her gaze softening. "Do you want to talk about it?" Jordan hesitated. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many emotions tangled up inside him. But he knew better than to speak too soon, especially when it came to something like this. People didn't understand. They couldn't. "I don't think you can help," he muttered, turning his attention back to the paper. He didn't want her to see the hurt in his eyes. He didn't want to make her feel like she was obligated to fix something that was beyond repair. But she didn't leave. She stood there, waiting, like she always did. "Jordan," she said gently, "this is important. You're not alone in this. I know it feels like it, but you're not." His eyes flicked up to meet hers, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he was expecting her to say, but it wasn't that. He didn't know how to respond. "Ms. Williams, I can't keep running," he said suddenly, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to fight this. Every time I think I'm getting a little bit of peace, someone reminds me that I don't belong here, that I'm nothing." Her gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it feels impossible, but you don't have to face this alone. You don't have to fight this battle by yourself." Before Jordan could respond, the bell rang, signaling the start of the next class. Ms. Williams gave him a small nod and left, leaving him alone with his thoughts. As he watched her walk away, he felt a strange sense of both comfort and isolation. She cared, but what good was that if nothing changed? The next day, The tension in the air was palpable. As Jordan entered the classroom, he immediately noticed the group of boys gathered by the back corner, talking in hushed tones. Jason and Tyler were at the center, their voices too low to be heard, but their body language, hands gesturing, heads turned toward him, was unmistakable. It was a familiar scene, one that Jordan had seen 100 times before. Jason's mocking, arrogant grin, Tyler's snide laugh, and the rest of the class, too afraid to speak up, too afraid to intervene. Jordan kept his head down as he walked to his seat, trying to ignore the group's attention. He knew it was coming, but he couldn't help the knot that formed in his stomach. He had always tried to keep a low profile, to fade into the background, but that didn't matter anymore. No matter how quiet he stayed, they would find him. They always did. The class started, and for a moment, Jordan allowed himself to get lost in the rhythm of the lesson, his mind drifting as the teacher spoke. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Jason stand up, a look of mischief in his eyes. "Hey, Jordan," Jason's voice rang out across the room, too loud for the moment, too full of intent. Jordan froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He could feel every eye in the room on him, the silence almost suffocating. Jason stepped forward, his usual smugness replaced by something more dangerous. A challenge, a dare. "Got something to say?" Jason sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "Why don't you just speak up for once? Or are you too scared?" The room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Jordan could feel his fists clench at his sides, the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through him. He wasn't scared, but he was tired of being pushed, tired of pretending that this was just part of the game. Jason's words hit him like a slap, but he refused to let them break him. He knew that if he responded, it would only escalate things. He knew that if he fought back, it would only prove that they were winning. So he stayed silent, his jaw set tight as he focused on the teacher at the front of the room, forcing himself not to react. But Jason wasn't finished. "You're nothing, Jordan," Jason spat, his voice laced with venom. "You're just a joke." The words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating him. Every inch of his body screamed for him to fight back, to say something, anything, but he remained still. The tension in the room thickened, the silence stretching longer than it should have. And then, as if to make sure everyone in the room knew what had just happened, Jason turned to the rest of the class, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Can anyone tell me why this guy thinks he belongs here?" he mocked. It was the final straw. The disruption, the way the room shifted with each word, had already set something in motion, something that couldn't be stopped. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. His hands balled into fists, not out of anger, but out of a need to do something, anything. The tension that had been building up inside him for years suddenly surged to the surface. And that was when it happened. A sharp noise rang out across the room, a loud, unmistakable crack, as Jordan's fist collided with Jason's jaw. The entire class went silent. Jason staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching for his face. Blood dripped from his lip, and for the first time, Jordan saw something in his eyes that he had never seen before: surprise, shock. Jordan stood there, his chest heaving, every muscle in his body tense. His mind raced, not sure of what had just happened, not sure if he could take it back. But there was no turning back now. The fight had begun. This inciting incident marks the turning point in Jordan's journey, a moment when everything he's tried to avoid, every ounce of tension he's built up inside him, is finally unleashed. It's the beginning of his transformation, the first crack in the armor he's been wearing for so long. And as the fight begins, so too does the larger conflict that will shape the rest of his life. Jordan's heart still raced from the moment he had thrown that punch. The sudden weight of his action sank in as he sat alone in the school's detention room, staring at the blank white walls. His fingers tapped restlessly against the metal desk, his mind replaying the moment over and over again. The crack of his fist against Jason's jaw, the stunned silence that followed, and the lingering feeling of liberation, albeit short-lived. There was no going back now. He had been sent here as a consequence for his outburst, but as far as he was concerned, detention was the least of his worries. The consequences outside these four walls were far worse. His action had been impulsive, a split-second decision driven by years of pent-up frustration, but it was also an undeniable message. He was no longer willing to sit quietly and endure the torment. However, that message hadn't been received the way he intended. Jason's group, including Tyler, had been riled up, visibly furious, and spreading rumors faster than wildfire. They had already started painting Jordan as the violent one, the aggressor. The school had been quick to act, siding with the victim, Jason, in a desperate bid to keep things from escalating. Jordan knew how these things worked. He was already the underdog, the problem student, who didn't belong. They would paint his actions as nothing more than a random outburst, a flash of anger from the troubled kid. They wouldn't care to understand. They never did. As he sat there, the door creaked open, breaking his thoughts. A soft, gentle voice entered the room. Jordan. He turned toward the doorway and saw Ms. Williams standing there, her expression concerned yet calm. She hadn't been there during the fight, and he hadn't been able to explain himself before being hauled off to detention. Her presence was like a breath of fresh air in the oppressive silence of the room. I didn't expect to see you here, she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Jordan shrugged, his eyes dropping to the desk. I guess I'm not as invisible as I thought. Ms. Williams pulled out a chair, sitting beside him. I know it's tough, she said, her tone gentle, understanding. But what you did, it won't solve everything. It might even make things harder for you. I don't care, he muttered under his breath, slouching in his seat. At least for once, someone knows I'm not going to sit back and take it. She looked at him with a soft sadness, something in her eyes that told him she knew all too well what it was like to be pushed to the edge. But she also knew the consequences of giving in to that anger. I get it, Jordan. I really do. But fighting fire with fire, it only burns you more in the end. Jordan shook his head, the frustration bubbling up again. And doing nothing gets me nowhere. I've been doing nothing for years, Ms. Williams. How do you think that feels? She remained silent for a moment, then placed a hand on his arm. I know, but there's always another way, even if it's not the easy one. You don't want to lose who you are in the process. He felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words pulling him down. His gaze hardened as he glanced out the small window, staring at the endless blue sky outside. It doesn't matter anymore. No one cares about who I am. The conversation lingered in the air between them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the tension settling over them like a thick fog. Then Ms. Williams stood up, placing a hand on his shoulder before turning to leave. I believe in you, Jordan. Don't forget that. The rest of the day passed by in a blur. Every hallway he walked down felt like a gauntlet. Every classroom, a battlefield. He could feel the eyes of his peers burning into his back, some filled with disdain, others with a mix of curiosity and fear. He kept his head low, doing his best to disappear. But no matter how hard he tried to sink into the background, he could still hear the whispers, still feel the weight of the eyes upon him. When he walked into his next class, the air was thick with tension. His seat, once an unremarkable corner of the room, now felt like a public stage. He could feel Jason's presence before he even saw him. Jason's smug grin, Tyler's cocky stance, the way the two of them seemed to radiate an unspoken power over the rest of the class. And sure enough, as soon as Jordan walked in, Jason's voice rang out. Hey, Jordan, Jason said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Did you forget where you belong? Thought you were special, huh? The class fell silent. Jordan could feel the heat rising in his face, the all-too-familiar feeling of humiliation creeping in. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but he held himself back. Jason chuckled, turning to Tyler. It's funny, right? That kid, always trying to act like he's better than us. Guess he's just another angry loser. Jordan clenched his fists under the desk, but it wasn't Jason's taunts that bothered him the most. It was the way the room reacted, the way no one stepped in to stop it, to say anything. They just watched waited. Even Ms. Williams, who had been his one ally, wasn't there to defend him. She was gone, and with her absence, the sense of safety she provided also disappeared. He was alone. Later that evening, Jordan walked home in a daze, the cold air stinging his face. The streetlights flickered as he passed, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks. He barely noticed the familiar streets, the houses he had walked by 1,000 times. The weight of his actions, the pressure mounting around him, had consumed his every thought. He hadn't expected the world to change after the fight. He hadn't expected a magical resolution where everything fell into place. But what he hadn't prepared for was the intense isolation that followed. The distance that had always been there between him and everyone else had only grown wider. It was as if the fight had carved a line in the sand, a barrier between him and the rest of the world. When he got home, the house was silent. His mother's car was parked in the driveway, but there were no sounds of life from inside. He walked in to find her in the kitchen, staring at the stove, lost in thought. "Hey," he said quietly. His mother looked up, her eyes tired, her face drawn. She smiled weakly, but didn't say anything at first. "I got into a fight today," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother's smile faltered, but she didn't seem angry. She just sighed, walking over to him and pulling him into an unexpected hug. "I know," she murmured, her voice soft. "I heard. Are you okay?" Jordan didn't answer. Instead, he let himself sink into the hug, the one place he could still feel safe. But even then, the weight of the situation loomed over him. His mother's silence spoke volumes. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't proud either. She didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right. Jordan pulled away, his gaze falling to the floor. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mom." She paused before replying. "Sometimes you don't know until you're in it, but you have to keep going. You can't let them win, not like this." Her words didn't have the comfort he needed. They were filled with resolve, with a sense of finality that only made the situation feel more hopeless. In the following days, things only seemed to escalate. Jason's grip on the school felt tighter, and the whispers turned to outright harassment. Jordan was no longer just the outsider. Now, he was the enemy. The weight of the world pressed down harder on his shoulders as the truth began to settle in. His actions had triggered something larger than himself. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He had become part of a larger story, a story that was unfolding in ways he couldn't yet understand. Every step he took forward seemed to lead him 2 steps back. The fight had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited a fire within the school. The stakes had been raised, and now there was no turning back. As Jordan sat in the quiet of his room, the sounds of the world outside seemed distant, muted. He knew things would get worse before they got better, but he also knew that somehow he had already crossed a line. There was no going back. He just had to figure out how to survive the fallout. The first turning point had arrived, and with it, a series of events set into motion that would change everything. The days after Jordan's confrontation with Jason had been a blur of tension and conflict. School, once a place of mundanity, had turned into an arena where every move he made was watched and scrutinized. The whispers never stopped. The side glances, the stifled laughs, the mocking comments. It was as if his entire existence had been reduced to a spectacle. Jordan tried to stay under the radar, burying himself in his work, keeping his distance from everyone, but it felt impossible. Everywhere he went, he was reminded of the choice he made, the punch, the rebellion, the act that had propelled him into a war he hadn't anticipated. It was during the second week of his newfound isolation that things began to shift, escalating in ways he couldn't have predicted. It started with an unexpected visit from Ms. Williams. She found him sitting by the old oak tree outside the school building, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the ground. Her footsteps were soft against the grass, but Jordan heard her approach long before she reached him. "Jordan," she said gently, sitting down beside him without asking, "How's everything going?" He didn't immediately respond. The words felt too loaded, too heavy to say out loud. He stared ahead, trying to avoid her gaze. "You're not the only one who's been affected by this," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "The entire school is divided, and it's becoming something bigger than just a fight. It's about what it represents." Jordan finally met her eyes. "It's always about what it represents, isn't it? But nobody cares what I feel. All they see is a black kid who snapped and is now paying the price." Ms. Williams sighed. "That's not true, Jordan. It's just that sometimes it's easier to label people and push them into categories than to actually understand what's going on beneath the surface." Jordan looked at her, his expression hard. "And what do you think is going on beneath the surface? All I see is a school that wants to pretend nothing ever happened, that I'm just some angry kid with no reason." She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think you're not alone in this, Jordan. The things you're feeling, there are others who feel them too, maybe not in the same way, but they feel them." Jordan scoffed. "Yeah, sure. If anyone cared, they'd have said something by now." Ms. Williams took a deep breath. "You might be surprised." The following day, things took a darker turn. Jordan had been used to the cold treatment from his classmates, but this time it was different. When he entered the classroom, the air felt thick with hostility. It was like walking into a room full of silent accusations. Jason's chair was empty, but Tyler was sitting there, leaning back in his seat with an unbothered smirk plastered across his face. He barely glanced at Jordan as he passed by, but it didn't matter. There were still the same murmurings from the back of the room, the same whispers that followed him like a shadow. The teacher arrived, but before she could begin the lesson, a note was passed to her. She read it, her face darkening. Without a word, she stood up and addressed the class. "Everyone, I have just been informed that due to recent events, the administration has decided to implement a new policy." Her voice was measured, but there was a noticeable tension in the way she spoke. "All students involved in the altercation between Jordan and Jason will be placed under temporary suspension, effective immediately. This is to ensure that the situation does not escalate any further." Jordan felt his chest tighten. The room fell deathly silent, and for a moment, it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The whispers started up again, this time louder, more insistent. His stomach churned, a knot of dread forming in his gut. But it wasn't just the suspension. It was the implications. The entire room was looking at him, not with sympathy or understanding, but with judgment. He was the scapegoat. He was the problem. The injustice of it all slammed into him, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. As Jordan sat in the principal's office later that afternoon, the weight of the decision weighed heavily on his shoulders. It was like a door had slammed shut behind him, cutting off any hope of redemption. Mrs. Peters, the principal, sat behind her desk, her eyes tired but unwavering. "You need to understand, Jordan, that this situation has gotten out of hand," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "We can't allow violence in this school, regardless of the circumstances." "I didn't start it," Jordan said, his voice raw, but his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Jason's been bullying me for months, but nobody cared about that." "Jordan," Mrs. Peters said, her tone firm yet calm, "it's never just about what you think. There are always bigger concerns at play. You can't always solve things with your fists." Jordan stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "I didn't start it, but no one wants to hear that. You're just punishing me because it's easier than confronting the real issue." Mrs. Peters' gaze hardened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He was done. He didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about what was fair or right. It was about control. It was about putting him in his place. "Fine," Jordan spat, his voice trembling with frustration. "Just send me home." Later that evening, as the weight of the suspension began to sink in, Jordan received a message on his phone. It was from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. Meet me after school tomorrow, at the old park near the edge of town." Jordan felt his pulse quicken. Who could this be? A part of him was cautious, suspicious even, but another part of him was desperate for answers, desperate for someone who might actually understand what he was going through. The next day, he showed up at the park. The air was chilly, the trees shivering in the breeze as he stood by the rusty swings, waiting. He heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Ms. Williams emerge from the shadows, her face serious, eyes scanning the area. "I didn't expect you to actually come," she said, her voice low. "But I need you to understand something, Jordan. You're not the only one who's been carrying this burden." Jordan frowned, confusion washing over him. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, glancing around before speaking again. "Jason isn't just a bully. He's part of something bigger. There are people, adults, who are making sure this stays under wraps. And I've been trying to find a way to expose them, but they're too powerful." Jordan's mind was reeling. "What are you saying? This is all connected." Ms. Williams nodded gravely. "Everything you're feeling, everything you've gone through, this is bigger than just high school drama. There's a system at play here, Jordan, and it's time to take it down. But you need to be ready. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore." Jordan's world tilted. What had started as a personal vendetta, a battle to survive his everyday torment, was suddenly much, much bigger. This wasn't just about him. It was about a system built on lies and manipulation, one that had been quietly controlling everything from the shadows. He didn't know what it meant to fight this kind of battle, but he knew one thing: he couldn't back down now. As the realization set in, Jordan felt a rush of emotions, fear, anger, and something else. A sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was no longer just reacting to the world around him. He was ready to take control, to fight back. And so, with the knowledge that everything had changed, Jordan made a decision. It was time to face the truth, and he would do it on his terms. Jordan's mind was a swirl of confusion and adrenaline. The meeting with Ms. Williams at the park had left him grappling with more questions than answers. Who were the adults involved in this? How deep did the corruption go? And what was he really being asked to do? Was this about justice or revenge? He hadn't anticipated any of this when he had stood up for himself that day. All he had wanted was to be left alone, to find a way to exist in this school without constantly having to fight for his dignity. But now, it felt like he had unwittingly stepped into something far darker and far more dangerous. The following week passed in a haze of tension. The school was divided, fractured into cliques and factions, each of them rallying behind their respective sides. Some supported Jason, claiming that Jordan had gone too far, that he was nothing but a troublemaker. Others, quietly, almost fearfully, chose to stand with Jordan, but only in whispers. They would glance nervously over their shoulders before saying anything, as if afraid that even the smallest gesture of support would bring their own personal retribution. Even Ms. Williams, who had been so steadfast in her determination to help Jordan, seemed to be pulling away slightly, as if the weight of the situation was beginning to get to her. Jordan's isolation deepened. At first, he had clung to the hope that he might make some kind of difference, that his fight would be worth it in the end. But the further he got into the mess, the more it felt like an endless spiral, with no clear way out. It was on a particularly bleak Wednesday afternoon that everything took a sudden, unexpected turn. Jordan had just finished his last class and was walking to the bus stop where he was approached by Tyler. The same Tyler who had once been part of Jason's inner circle. The same Tyler who had been one of the first to spread rumors about Jordan after the fight. But today, Tyler wasn't the cocky, arrogant jock Jordan had grown to despise. Today, there was something different about him, something desperate in his eyes. "Hey," Tyler said quietly, stepping into Jordan's path. Jordan stopped, suspicion creeping up his spine. "What do you want, Tyler?" Tyler glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else was around. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Jordan didn't move. "I don't trust you." "I get that," Tyler said, his voice strained. "But this isn't about what you think. Just listen to me for a second, all right?" Jordan hesitated, then shrugged, half joking. This ought to be good. But when Tyler's expression shifted from irritation to something darker, almost fearful, Jordan's gut tightened. Something was off. And in that moment, he realized that this was no longer just about schoolyard drama. Whatever was happening now was bigger than both of them. Tyler took a deep breath, leaning in closer. "Jason, he's been keeping something from you. Something that could change everything." Jordan's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Tyler's voice dropped to a near whisper. It's about Ms. Williams. The words hit Jordan like a punch to the gut. Ms. Williams, he repeated, struggling to understand. What about her? Look, Tyler continued, his voice trembling. I don't know all the details, but Jason, he's been feeding her information. He's been working with her behind the scenes. He's the one who told her to get you suspended. Jordan's mind raced. You're lying. Tyler shook his head, urgency in his voice. I'm not. I swear to God. I didn't even know until recently. But Jason's been using her to cover his tracks, to make sure he stays on top. He's got his own agenda, Jordan. And it's not just about you. It's about everyone. Jordan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. All the pieces started to fall into place. The tension in the air, the way Ms. Williams had been acting strangely distant, her cryptic words. Why are you telling me this? Tyler took a step back, his face clouded with guilt. Because I can't be part of it anymore. Jason's going too far. I don't know how deep this goes, but I can't just sit back and watch people get hurt. Jordan was silent, his mind working overtime to process everything. If what Tyler was saying was true, then everything had been a lie. The suspension, the rumors, the tension. It was all orchestrated by Jason and Ms. Williams, two people he had trusted. I need proof, Jordan said finally, his voice tight. If you want me to believe you, I need proof. Tyler nodded. I know. I can get you something concrete. But you have to trust me. Jordan studied Tyler's face, trying to read him. Was this a trap? Was this some kind of manipulation? A way for Jason to get him to turn on Ms. Williams? Or was it the truth? He couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. Everything was about to change. The next day, Jordan received a message from Tyler. It was cryptic, but it was enough to send a chill through his veins. Meet me after school. I'll bring what you need. Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. The stakes were higher now. If Tyler was telling the truth, then the betrayal went deeper than he could have ever imagined. And if he wasn't, Jordan would be walking right into a trap, completely unaware. Still, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. After school, Jordan made his way to the back of the school, near the old storage shed. The place was quiet, the fading light casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. He felt a growing sense of unease, but there was no turning back now. Tyler was already there, standing in the shadows, waiting. When he saw Jordan, he stepped forward, his hand holding a small envelope. This is everything, Tyler said, his voice low. It's all there, the proof. Jordan took the envelope with trembling hands, his mind racing. He opened it slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. Inside was a series of photographs of Ms. Williams, meeting with Jason in secret, in places she had no business being. There were also documents, notes, evidence that Jason had been feeding her information about Jordan, controlling the narrative, ensuring that he was framed as the troublemaker. Jordan felt his stomach turn. This was worse than he could have imagined. The betrayal ran deep. Ms. Williams, the one person who had shown him any semblance of kindness, had been working with Jason all along. This doesn't make sense, Jordan muttered, his hands shaking as he looked through the photos. Why would she do this? Tyler shrugged. I don't know. Maybe she's in too deep. Maybe she was manipulated. I don't have all the answers, but I know this. Jason is the one pulling the strings, and he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. This was no longer just about a fight in the hallways. This was a conspiracy, a game being played at his expense, and he had no choice but to play along. He had no choice but to fight back. But now, as the pieces fell into place, Jordan realized that the stakes had escalated. This wasn't just about a single fight. This was about something bigger, something that would change everything. Jordan stood at the edge of the school parking lot, his fingers numb as he clutched the envelope. The photographs burned in his hands, the weight of the betrayal now sinking in with a cold, suffocating intensity. He could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, ready to burst, but he forced himself to breathe, to focus. The clock was ticking. Everything was about to change. Ms. Williams had been everything to him. His ally, his protector, the one teacher who had seen through the barriers he had built around himself. But now, as the sun dipped low behind the school's towering walls, Jordan's world had been shattered. The realization that she had been working with Jason, feeding him information, undermining his every step. It felt like a cruel joke, one he was no longer sure how to laugh at. But there was no time to wallow in betrayal. There was only one thing left to do: confront her, expose the truth, and take back control of his own story. He scanned the lot, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her car parked near the farthest corner. She was here, somewhere. He knew it. The cold air wrapped around him like a vice, but he refused to shiver. This was it. No more running. No more pretending. As he walked toward her car, his footsteps echoed louder than usual, as though the weight of the moment had turned every sound into a drumbeat of impending confrontation. He had to do this. For himself. For the truth. For everyone who had ever been wronged. And yet, a small voice inside him asked, "What if you're making a mistake? What if you're wrong about everything?" But the doubt didn't last long. Jason's face flashed in his mind. The smug smile, the arrogance, the way he had tormented Jordan for months. No, this was bigger than just Ms. Williams. This was a war, and Jordan was in the middle of it. Reaching the car, Jordan took a deep breath and knocked on the window. His heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained steady, locked in a mask of defiance. The window rolled down slowly, and Ms. Williams' eyes flickered with surprise when she saw him. She had been expecting to see someone else, maybe Jason, maybe anyone but Jordan, but the shock on her face quickly melted into something else, something colder. A silence hung between them, heavy, laden with the tension of unspoken words. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft, but the edge of caution was unmistakable. "I know what you've been doing," Jordan said, his voice steady but forceful. "I know about you and Jason." For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then, as if making a decision, she leaned back in her seat, letting out a long sigh. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "Jordan," she began, her voice almost pleading, "you don't understand. It's not what you think." "Not what I think." His anger flared, but he kept in check. "I saw the photos. I know about the meetings, the lies. How long were you planning on pretending? How long were you going to let me fight for something that was already lost?" Ms. Williams' eyes welled with tears, her composure crumbling in front of him. "It's not that simple. I didn't want any of this to happen. Jason, he's dangerous, Jordan. He's been manipulating me, too. You think I'm the only one he's been using? He has so many strings in this school, so many connections. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping you safe, trying to protect you from the real danger. By lying to me? By keeping me in the dark?" "I had no choice," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Jason threatened me. He said if I didn't do what he wanted, he'd ruin my career, my life. And I believed him. I didn't think there was any way out. But now I see what it's cost. I see what's happening to you." Jordan's mind raced as he processed her words. He wanted to feel sorry for her. He wanted to believe her. But the truth was, no matter how she tried to explain it, the betrayal still stung. It still burned deep inside him, a wound that couldn't be healed by just a few words of regret. "You think I'm just going to let you explain everything away," he said, his voice low and controlled, but with an undeniable edge of finality. "You've been a part of this for too long, Ms. Williams. I can't just walk away from this." She looked down, a tear escaping from her eye, and for a moment, she looked like a broken woman, a woman who had made mistakes, who had been cornered by forces beyond her control. But it didn't change what had happened. It didn't change what she had allowed. "You have to believe me, Jordan," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could protect you. But Jason, he's too powerful. He has people everywhere. He's been manipulating everyone, even me." Jordan clenched his fists, stepping back from the car. He could feel the weight of her words, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. It was time to put an end to this. to take control of his story. He could no longer afford to let the strings of others control him. "You're right about one thing," Jordan said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Jason is dangerous, but so am I." He turned away, his resolve hardening. "I'm done being a pawn in his game." Before Ms. Williams could say anything else, Jordan strode away from the car, his mind racing. He had to act fast. There was no time for second thoughts, no room for hesitation. Jason had to be stopped. No more lies. No more manipulation. He was going to expose everything, every secret that had been buried. The truth would come to light, no matter what it cost. As he reached the edge of the parking lot, Jordan paused, looking back over his shoulder. He saw Ms. Williams still sitting in her car, watching him. Her face was a mask of regret and resignation, but he didn't wait for her to speak. He had made his choice. And now, there was no turning back. That night, Jordan sat in his room, the photographs scattered across his desk. He had called in a few favors, gathered the evidence he needed, and now it was time to bring the fight to Jason. There was no room for doubt anymore. No more playing by his rules. This was Jordan's moment. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he had been given, Tyler's number. There was no going back now. Tyler picked up on the second ring. "Jordan, you good?" "I'm ready," Jordan said, his voice steady but thick with determination. "Let's finish this." The tension in the air felt like an electric charge as Jordan prepared to face Jason, to face the man who had orchestrated everything, the man who had taken so much from him. He was no longer afraid. The time for fear was over. Now, it was about reclaiming his future. This was the moment that would define him. Jordan stood alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His fingers still trembled slightly, even after all he had done. The confrontation was over. Jason was exposed, his empire of lies and manipulation crumbling. But there was no relief in the victory, only a lingering emptiness that filled the spaces between his breaths. He looked at the photographs scattered across his desk, the evidence of Jason's treachery now spread out like the pieces of a shattered puzzle. It was over, but it didn't feel like it. His mind kept returning to Ms. Williams, the regret in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. Was it enough? Was the truth really enough to fix everything? To heal the wounds she had caused? The question gnawed at him, but there was no answer, no clear path to follow. All he knew was that he had done what needed to be done. The truth had come to light, the lies had been exposed, and Jason had been forced to face the consequences of his actions. But that didn't mean everything would go back to the way it was before. Things had changed. Jordan had changed. The door to his room creaked open, and his mother stepped in, her face drawn with concern. She had been worried about him for days, ever since he'd started to talk about the investigation, about the things he'd uncovered. And now, seeing him in this state, she couldn't hide her apprehension. "Jordan," she asked softly, crossing the room toward him, "how are you feeling?" He didn't answer right away, unsure of what to say. The emotions that had been building inside him for weeks were still too raw to put into words. There was anger, certainly. There was relief. But underneath it all, there was an undeniable sadness. A sadness for all the things he had lost, for all the people who had failed him, and for all the things he would never get back. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "It's done. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would." His mother sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "That's because you've been through something that changes you," she said quietly. "When you fight for the truth, when you fight for what's right, it doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes the hardest part is knowing that no matter what happens, things will never be the same again." Jordan's gaze flickered back to the photographs on the desk. It was hard to deny her words. He had exposed Jason for the fraud he was, had stripped away the lies and deceit, and yet he didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollow, as if the fight had taken more from him than he had gained. The damage had been done, and even though he had won, there was no way to undo it. "I don't know what I expected," Jordan said, shaking his head. Maybe I thought there'd be some kind of justice. Maybe I thought everything would fall into place. But I don't feel better. I don't feel like I've won." His mother nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Sometimes, the hardest battles don't end with a sense of victory. They just leave you with more questions. And that's okay. What matters is that you stood up for what you believe in, that you didn't let fear control you. That takes courage. Jordan let out a bitter laugh. Courage. I don't know if that's what it feels like right now. Courage isn't always loud, his mother said softly. Sometimes, it's quiet. It's the strength to keep going when the world feels like it's falling apart. Jordan didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to. There was a part of him that wanted to believe in the comfort of her words, to believe that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he was still reeling from everything that had happened. Jason was gone, but there were still so many loose ends, so many unanswered questions. He wasn't sure how to pick up the pieces of his life after everything had been turned upside down. There was a knock at the door, pulling him out of his thoughts. His mother stood up and crossed the room to answer it. When she opened the door, a familiar face stood in the doorway, Ms. Williams. Jordan's heart skipped a beat, his first instinct being to turn away, to avoid facing her. But he didn't. He forced himself to stay where he was, to face her. "I just wanted to say," Ms. Williams began, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure how to approach him. "I'm sorry, Jordan, for everything. I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I could fix it, but I see now that I was wrong. I hurt you, and for that, I'll never be able to fully make amends." Jordan didn't speak at first. He could see the regret in her eyes, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain she had caused. The scars, the betrayal, the feeling of being abandoned when he had needed her most. It was too much to just forgive, but at the same time, a small part of him understood. She had been caught in a web of lies too, manipulated by forces beyond her control. "Don't know what you want me to say," Jordan finally said, his voice distant. "I don't know how to feel. You were supposed to be the one person I could trust, and you let me down." Ms. Williams flinched at his words, but she didn't back away. She stood there, waiting, as if giving him the space to process everything. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. The anger that had burned so hot in him earlier was fading, replaced by a sense of numbness. The conflict was over, but the emotional aftermath was only beginning. Ms. Williams stayed for a while, talking quietly with his mother, but Jordan remained silent, lost in his own thoughts. He knew that the truth had come out. Jason's lies had been exposed, his manipulations unmasked. But even though the world seemed a little bit clearer, Jordan still didn't feel at peace. He felt like he had lost something that couldn't be replaced: trust, innocence, a sense of security. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. The school was buzzing with the aftermath of Jason's exposure, his reign of manipulation finally over. But for Jordan, it was hard to feel a sense of relief. The victory had been bittersweet. He still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. As the weeks passed, the world around him slowly returned to normal. Ms. Williams had resigned, leaving the school for good, and Jason's name became a distant memory, his influence fading with each passing day. But for Jordan, the wounds remained. They weren't visible, but they were there, hidden beneath the surface, reminding him of the price he had paid for the truth. And yet, despite everything, despite the pain and the loss, there was a flicker of something else, something hopeful. He had survived. He had fought back, and in the end, he had done what was right. But even as he moved forward, Jordan knew that the scars of this battle would stay with him forever. And maybe that was the way it was meant to be.